make some decisions on their own. On the right side, it's much more specific, much more directed. And in this area and some other industries, sometimes the right side is very much preferred, particularly by small businesses, because they have it's very straightforward how to comply.
The question of regulatory certainty is answered for you very much more on the right side. Next. So most agencies have some sort of combination of these two, and since Canada's in the room, I would say Canada has definitely got a good approach to layering and sort of moving along the regulatory spectrum from prescriptive to performance to even management systems oriented regulation.
And I would say the management systems that we talked a little bit about this morning, safety management systems, that's yet another form of regulation that's distinct from performance and prescriptive.
And out there a bit. So what we really wanted to get into, I think, is how we can approach performance regulation better as we look at continuous improvement, state of transition, and as I look back to my experience with the integrity management rule, back into the year 2000, if I knew then what I knew now, what I would do differently. So I think that there's a lot of questions in government about how to make performance approach to regulation work better. The government definitely likes it. The General Accountability Office likes it. OMB has a circular that talks about it being a preferred way. But what does it really take to do it right? And so I wanted to offer food for thought on some of the things from my experience that I wish we could do a little bit more of as we approach performance regulation approaches in the future. We know they will be there. So certainly the issue of training and qualification, going into a more subjective approach to overseeing regulatory activity, as we did with the integrity management program, took an awful lot of preparation of our existing workforce to get them ready to be able to look at such subjective questions. I think that while there was an awful lot of discussion prior to going into rulemaking, as we get into more complex issues, dealing with concepts far down the road, before you going into the rulemaking process, it's so much easier in an informal setting to be able to talk about what's the problem we're trying to solve. What do we want the outcomes to be? What kind of metrics will we employ to be able to see that we're getting the desired results? My personal preference, I don't know how many times I've been asked, so what do you think about protocol-based regulation, Ms. Gerard? I think that if we could talk about cradle to grave, how will this program be enforced? What means would an inspector use to make a judgment about the operator's thinking and how far down the road the operator is with the process maturity? Would be a good thing to have laid out on the table prior to going into the rulemaking process. Understanding what the best practices are, what standards and technologies are available, would be good to be well understood by all the stakeholders. And for stakeholders like those that are in the room, to be able to have the opportunity to lay this out in free-form discussions so that you could weigh in at the beginning of the concept rather than after it's fairly well shaped and the options are much more limited, would go a long way to getting good buy-in. And safety culture focused. We heard the administrator talk about that as being one of the underpinning values of a safety management system. Understanding what the role of the employee is in terms of the flow of information in the company and how that feeds into being able to comply with a performance-based regulation is very important in my view.
Next slide. So that last slide, which was very detailed, was Stacey's perspective as someone who implements performance-based regulations. Very detailed, lots of specifics, lots of underlying information behind each of those bullet points. I, as a public interest advocate, and I have an engineering background, for those of you who don't know, I sit on the National Academy of Sciences committee. I was just in DC where we met on performance-based safety regulations. And we are analyzing where those make sense. PHMSA is the client organization, is paying for the analysis, but there are members of the committee, academics and others who have backgrounds from other agencies, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, for example, and other experiences. And so what I have brought to the table are these 5 points roughly about what are the challenges with performance-based safety regulations. So Stacey talked about how you have to have the right training and qualifications. It's actually tough. If you've been a regulator for 20 years and you've worked on prescriptive regs, moving to a performance-based approach where the operator is making all kinds of decisions that you're not a part of may be very tough. It may be very tough for you to inspect. It may be very tough to do enforcement. I'm skipping to the third point. There's a case right now that the trust is following where the operator said, you didn't require us to actually make a change. We did consider whether we should. We decided it wasn't important, and then they had an incident. So they are arguing that if PHMSA really wanted something to be done, it should have been required and been very specific about it. So, enforcement is much more complicated. How do you know when someone made a bad decision that resulted into a bad outcome when there were 20 factors they were considering? So worker engagement is critical. Overseas, where you have much more of a unionized workforce that is looking at the offshore work environment, they are very much a part of the decision making in the United States. In the offshore environment, that's just not true. Workers don't have the same rights and ability to feed into the operational decisions and safety decisions as they do in comparable operations overseas. Likewise, in terms of the number of regulators in the offshore operating environment, how many facilities are they overseeing? What are the qualifications of the regulators? We're not at the same level as the UK and Norway when you're talking about offshore production and exploration. So they have very much a performance-based approach, and I guess I'm raising a lot more cautions about what would be true here. And then finally, the last point is critical about transparency and reporting of the outcomes, and that also means how do you deal with near misses? Now, I'm not saying all near misses necessarily need to be reported to the public, but by collecting that information, having more comfort with providing it to maybe not the regulators exactly in the aviation industry. They report their near misses to NASA. Offshore in this country, the near misses are going to be reported to the Bureau of Transportation Statistics. So the important point is that we need to learn from decisions made by operators and what were the results. Long way to go before the pipeline sector, it seems, maybe this discussion will help speed it up a little bit, is where we need to be in terms of having the public would have the trust it might need to have to allow increased performance regulations on a broader scale within this industry.